organizer at the University of Alabama, Shreya Pokral. Shreya, welcome to 1A.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, talk a little bit about the controversy around the building I mentioned, the Bell Wallace Gymnasium on the grounds of the University of Alabama.
So like you said, this building is named after George Wallace, who is famously a segregationist. This building isn't widely used for classes currently, but is still very visible on campus and is very much as students enter the campus for the first time as they're touring, it's something that comes up often, or their freshman year on campus, they notice this building and they ask, why is there a building named after a segregationist on a campus as diverse and promisingly inclusive as UAB is? And so this is a conversation that continuously comes up amongst the student body.
You say it comes up a lot. It's not one or two people knocking on the door of the student union. I mean, it comes up a lot among students. What do they say when they say, "Wow, George C. Wallace"? Why does it say that?
So there's no movement around Lister Hill currently, but there's a wider one around George Wallace, and I am part of a student coalition called Students for Justice in Birmingham, along with three other student activists, and we are working to implement a human rights trail on campus that would mark 14 different locations on campus where historical civil rights movement situations occurred, from integrating UAB to the funerals of the 3 of the 4 girls who were murdered in the 16th Street Baptist Church. And we hope to place a marker at the George Wallace building saying the holistic story of George Wallace, from saying that he donated a lot of money to UAB, kind of made the university what it is today by donating lots of money and furthering its medical enterprise and everything, but also acknowledging that he was a segregationist and would not have agreed with a majority of the students' population just because of who they are.
So what you're talking about is an effort from the perspective of you and your allies to tell the full story of George Wallace, not just, you see buildings named after someone, you assume, oh, that must have been a grand person who was great for my state or the state where I go to school. You're not talking about scrubbing that name in Alabama. You're talking about a fuller story.
So the student group I am part of, we are working on the markers. While we stand in support with removing the name, that's not the initiative that we're currently working on ourselves, but we support the effort to remove its name.
So the tension around Wallace's name on some of these buildings, though, Shreya, it was amplified, as I understand it, by some white supremacist activity happening on campus in the recent past. Talk about that.
So last spring, it was publicly acknowledged or known that there was several white supremacists on campus who identified or joined the organization Identity Europa, which is now called the American Identity Movement. And this group was part of the Charlottesville protests. They've been very active in white supremacist chat rooms, and that's aspect of American society. And so when that information is released to the public, I am also part of a student group called UAB Students for Diversity and Campus Safety of 6 students who came together to organize a protest and demand that the university take a stronger stance against white supremacy, acknowledge that white supremacy is terrorism, and condemn it fully. Because when the white supremacists were first revealed to the general public, the university sent out a very general email saying racism is bad, we don't stand by it, but refused to actively condemn white supremacy. And it took 6 months of continuous back and forth meetings, protest demands, for that to fully happen.
And it did happen.
Yes, it did happen in, I believe, September or October of last year, but we have other demands such as increased diversity programming on campus, providing mandated diversity training for faculty employees, things like that haven't been implemented yet.
Do you feel like you're making headway on campus with acknowledging not only the history of George Wallace and telling a fuller story, but the university being serious about these activities that need exposure on campus?
I think seriousness is definitely present within the student body, because the student body recognizes white supremacy as terrorism, and that is a threat to the majority of our campus, because a lot of our students do identify with multiple marginalized backgrounds that white supremacists have a huge problem with just because they are existing. And so I believe within the student body is taken seriously. I believe the university takes it serious to an extent. I don't think they do everything that they absolutely could be doing and holding the white supremacists accountable. It's not a both sides sort of. They take the position of white supremacy as a belief and not being a white supremacist is another belief, but white supremacy is terrorism, and they don't recognize it as such, and so that concerns me.
It's a tough one. If there's no violence, physical violence, the university would be tempted, I think, to say the First Amendment protects really uncomfortable, bad, hateful, awful speech. It just protects it, and we can identify it, but there's nothing really more we should do.
Yes, and as a public university, that's the issue that we run into. But I know with some of the supremacists who've been outed, there have been hints towards inciting violence within the speech that have been released to the public, and so it's concerning to me that it's not being taken seriously by the university.
Right. So let's get back on the legacy of George Wallace, who has buildings named after him on campus, plaques in other buildings. You walk by through the lobby, there's the face of George C. Wallace, the former segregationist governor of Alabama. We got this voicemail from a listener who grew up in Alabama when George Wallace was governor. And here's what they had to say about the buildings that are still named for him across the state today.
I was born and raised in Alabama in the 50s and the 60s, and I was there during all of that, the integration of the university, and George Wallace being voted in, and then his accident. So I don't see a problem with those buildings being named after him because he apologized publicly to the African American, well as black then community.
Shreya, what do you think about what Laura has to say, that George Wallace apologized to the black community in Alabama, that he had something of an emotional reckoning and tried to make amends in front of the public, and so that is part of his legacy, that story is being told, and so that keeping the names of the buildings is part of that, and that it's okay?
Well, I'm not black, so I can't speak to the black experience or the perceptions that black people may have on his apology, but from my experience and from the many conversations I've had with black students and students of other marginalized backgrounds on campus, students primarily see his name being on the building as a threat or makes it very uncomfortable for students to enter campus. Even though he apologized to the community in his later years, that was in his later years, and that apology doesn't absolve everything he did when he was governor, when he was making these very harmful remarks that really damaged and terrorized a lot of people or led to the continuation of their terrorization. So I personally don't believe that a apology near the end of his life totally absolves him of everything he said before. And I don't know if he had, from my personal experience, from like what I've read about him and everything, I don't know if he did enough work in the later years of his life to make up sort of for what he had said earlier.
So Shreya, whether or not the names of the buildings come off, or whether or not there are plaques or a more fulsome telling of the George Wallace story around campus, do you feel that at the very least your activism and that of your colleagues has fostered a broader conversation among campus? I mean, are students talking about it among each other? Are white students talking about it? Students who are from Alabama who maybe it's possible before they got to the university never heard anyone say a critical word about George Wallace?
Mm-hmm. I would hope so.
Do you think it's happening?
I think it is. I think our work, we've been keeping it under wraps for a long time because we've been trying to figure out finances and funding and things of that nature. But when we started becoming more public about our work and talking to more students about it, we've received very, very positive feedback and a lot of suggestions on what we should include next, such as including the names of the Native American communities that used to reside on UAB's land before it was occupied by white settlers. So we've received a lot of great feedback from Black, white, Asian students, Hispanic students, and so I hope to continue receiving that in the future and broadening the conversation on campus and continuing this initiative to not only include the markers but also programs and other implementation on campus that would continue the conversation.
And what about those history professors? Are they encouraging you as well?
Yes, we have this faculty advisory board, and they've been extremely supportive and encouraging of us.
Well, that's good to hear. Shreya Packrell is a student activist on the campus of the University of Alabama. There are buildings and plaques all over the campus commemorating former Governor George C. Wallace, segregationist governor of the Civil Rights era, who proclaimed segregation now, segregation forever. Shreya, I want to thank you for broadening the conversation to us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, coming up, we're going to add some new voices and continue